I will just invite. Okay. Good morning, good evening, everyone. So this is Dr. Leo Lin, and I'm currently in Sydney, Australia. And this is a great opportunity for us to host this book talk regarding our new publication regarding Indo-Pacific, especially in the Southeast Asia region. And because of some schedule change, so we will first invite Dr. Satoru Nagao to speak about his view and, of course, his chapter. And after that, I will give a brief overview of the book, and then following by our editors' like remarks and other speakers' remarks. Uh, so if everyone is okay with this, we will first invite Dr. Satoru Nagao, and I will read his bio a little bit. So Dr. Satoru Nagao is a non-resident fellow at Hudson Institute, now based in Tokyo, Japan, with expertise in U.S., Japan, India security cooperation. Dr. Nagao's primary research area is U.S., Japan, India security cooperation. And he earned his PhD in 2011 from Nakushan University with the pioneering thesis on India's military strategy. And he holds multiple research positions, including director at the International Security Industry Council and security fellow roles across Japan, India, and Sri Lanka. So as we can see, he's very experienced and international scholar. And without the further ado, let's welcome Dr. Nagao to give his view and his talk. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I need to apologize because of my mistake of the calculations. Time has come to leave, so that's why it's only 5 minutes from now I have. So that's why I will be the first speaker in this case, despite most of the other speakers are very prominent compared with me. So thank you very much. I want to speak. So maybe 1 or 2 minutes. I summarize what kind of the part I have contributed in this book. Indeed, my chapter is chapter 6, and talk about potential of the Quad. So what kind of the chapter is firstly I analyze what happened, what kind of China's activity in the sea around Japan, Taiwan, South China Sea, India-China border, or Indian Ocean, and try to identify 3 features of the China's territorial expansion. And in this case, how does the Quad work is the topic in this chapter. And I pointed 3 things. Firstly, related to the value. So, and secondly, related to the defense or military issues. And the third one is related with more wider area, including non-military issue. Why I focusing on these 3? Because these 3 similarity of the China territory expansion is compared with much or how to deal with it. So first feature is China's territory expansion is repeated disregard for the current international law when laying claim on new territory. So for example, the East China Sea, the China is claiming the Senkaku Island just now, but before 1970s, they haven't claimed. So suddenly they changed their stance. So similar situation has happened in South China Sea and Indian Ocean. That's why firstly, how important respecting rule-based order based on current international law is matter. So in this case, Quad should collaborate and repeatedly express this. And that is the first reason I pointed out. Second one is when China find a power vacuum, they expand territories, I pointed out. So 1950s, 1970s, 1980s, 90s, every time when they find a power vacuum, they try to steal the territory. That is a feature. So to deal with this situation, how to maintain military balance is a matter. So Quad should cooperate, because if Quad country cooperate, China need to divide their defense budget multiple fronts. So that is the reason. And thirdly, China's territorial expansion is based on integrated strategy, combination of the military and non-military policy. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a civil purpose infrastructure project, but this project, when we check the location of this one, this infrastructure project has happened along with China's energy supply route from Middle East to China, and try to avoid Malacca Strait, try to avoid crossing Malacca Strait is the purpose. So from this infrastructure project is not purely the non-military civil purpose project. This is strategic project, so including the military aspect. So that's why to deal with this, the Quad should cooperate in the non-military area. That is one of the example of the integration of the military and non-military, which written in this book. But at the same time, these are the reasons I pointed out. So that's why should the Quad do? How does the Quad work? Is these ones are based on the analysis, so as a final part, what should the Quad do as the next step that I pointed out? That is my chapter. So I wish this part contributes real policy, or many leaders who has influences in this policy, or even if anyway, that I wish it will contribute something. Thank you very much. And maybe if there is a question related with this, I should receive and reply within the 1 or 2 minutes and leave. Sorry for that. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Dr. Nagao. So Professor Cogan, do you have any questions since you have your mic on?
Oh, I'm sorry. I just said that's a pretty good job for just a few minutes. Just must be practice at conferences.
Dr. Nagao, just I have a query, like looking at the new administration in the United States, Trump 2.0. How do you see the Japan-US relations? What is expectations from the Japanese side?
Okay, of course, there are many media reports which worry about the Trump administration, but in my image, his policy is simple, and indeed, my image is positive. Because Trump administration focusing on the simple bilateral talk based, and for example, the ideology or other aspects do not intervene in this negotiation, just intimidate after that deal. In the bilaterally, it's a pattern of the diplomacy when Trump was the president. So that's why indeed this negotiation itself is quite simple and understandable. That's why the situation itself will be based on this simple negotiation is one of the good thing, I believe. And at the same time, Trump himself is the famous unpredictable president, but unpredictability looks like submarine. Submarines, strong point of submarines, we cannot identify where is the submarine. That's why submarine is strong. So it looks like this, unpredictability itself could be the power of the US policy. So that's why not only the friend, but also the enemies, including China and Russia, they cannot identify the victory scenario when they try to initiate a war. So maybe what situation in the world will be a little bit calm because of the unpredictability, I believe. So that's why my image is positive. But in Japan, the Japanese Prime Minister, their domestic political power situation is unstable now. So that's why when the Trump asked Japan to deal, but the Japanese Prime Minister do not have the power to do that. That is maybe a concerning situation now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Miguel. Well, we know that you have time limit and you're leaving, and
Waffa,
we would like to thank.
Waffa, you want to have your
Yeah.
question? Please go ahead. Waffa, Dr. Nagao
Yes.
is leaving. Mhm.
I mean, if Dr.
Any
Nagao
questions?
have time, just for 1 minute. Hi, Dr. Nagao. I think we met a couple months ago. I'm from CSIS Indonesia. We were there in a JFIR meeting. I think we met you before. Just my question would be, what is the state of discussion in Japan with regards to a Taiwan contingency now that we're closer to timelines such as 2027 and this type of thing? How's the assessment from Japan? How likely do you think this is? And I think this is really in relation with Dr. Indu's question as well about, I guess, the reliability of your alliance with the U.S. Of course, should something happens there in the cross-strait relations, how would you like to, position yourselves? Just very short.
Very short answer. Very short answer. If China attack Taiwan, Japan will protect Taiwan because there is no other scenario we can imagine. Because China need to win if they start war. This means that China need to control the air. But to control the air, they need to attack the airbase in Japan. So it is unavoidable. Because if you can imagine U.S. fighter jet fly from the base in Japan and attack the Chinese invading force and return to the sacred place, this means that base in Japan could be the invincible and not touchable base without China attack Japan. So China need to attack Japan anyway. Thank you very much. That's the shortest answer of the question. I need to leave, but sorry for that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I understand. Thank you very much, Dr. Nagao. Thank you for your time. So we will carry on. In the following book talk, so we will do some important items. First, I will still need to have a brief intro about this book, in case that some of our audience they did not get a chance to read the book. So a brief intro might be necessary. And also the second point is bear in mind that the U.S. election is just over, and we will be talking about Trump in his neglect of his presidency. So Trump 2.0 is one of our key topics today. So for speakers, you may want to include your perspective after sharing your contributions to the book about what's your perspective about the current situation and your prospect for the future. All right. So if everyone's okay with that, I will first give a very brief intro about the book. So in this book, Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific Contract, we explore Southeast Asia's shifting security dynamics amid U.S. China competition in the Indo-Pacific region. So on one hand, as like Dr. Nagao mentioned, China's action combining military and non-military, and its assertive action in the South China Sea raised concerns for many countries. And on the other hand, Southeast Asian countries approach new security frameworks like the Quad and AUKUS. They do that with caution. So this book examines how Southeast Asian countries and the stakeholders navigate this complex environment, striving for peace and stability while protecting their autonomy amidst this intensifying U.S.-China rivalry. And I think that our talk today is really timely. And personally, I would also like to hear and listen to everyone's perspective regarding how do you see U.S.-China relations will be going under President Trump. Since Dr. Nagao, well, I think that's a very good opening. He has the feature of unpredictability, and that's a very good example from Dr. Nagao. So, like it's his style is like submarine, very powerful, but a little bit unpredictable. So I have interest in knowing from your perspective, how do you see the future regarding the power politics and especially the political economic dynamics in this region. All right. And first, I will introduce our editor, Dr. Indu Saxena, to give a little bit like a remark and her view regarding this book and the current situation. A short bio, Dr. Indu Saxena is a geopolitical and security expert. She's a fellow and chief operating officer and leads the consortium of Indo-Pacific researchers. Prior to this, she serves as an acting director, a deputy director, senior researcher, and team lead at the consortium. She has a PhD in political science. Her thesis focuses on terrorism and human rights, and she worked as an assistant professor in political science at the university and college level. And her research is focused on international security, Indo-Pacific security, South Asia, and Southeast Asian regions. So now let's welcome Dr. Saxena. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Leo, and for such a generous introduction. First of all, I welcome you all here at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers for this book launch discussion. I would like to express my gratitude alongside my esteemed co-editor, Dr. Stephen Nagy. Unfortunately, due to the health reasons, he is not able to speak today at this discussion, and for the opportunity to discuss our newly published volume, Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific Construct. Next, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to NOAA publishers in New York and the distinguished experts who contributed as a writer and authors of the chapters to the blurb, the experts who wrote the blurb for our volume, and Professor Sato from the Tokyo, who wrote the foreword, that have greatly enhanced this work. So please allow me to share the inspiring journey behind this book. Actually, we started this project in late 2021, and idea came following the various discussions of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and regional dynamics at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. The discussion was aimed to explore the ways to examine the involvement of Southeast Asian countries in the Indo-Pacific, and hence got an opportunity to showcase the diverse regional perspectives in a comprehensive volume. And here we are. We are lucky to find the subject matter experts, and some of them are here with us today: Professor Cogan, Waffa, Kharisma, and Dr. Nagao, and Dr. Leo, and our military history team. Of course, personally, I believe that it is important to prioritize individuals with extensive regional expertise, specifically from the target country, where you can harness their native insights and deep understanding of the local context, which can greatly benefit the project. And I would like to mention our contributors' names here so that due credit can be done towards them. From Malaysia, Dr. Tharichi Krishnan, and on the Philippines, the chapter is written by Professor Renato. And on Indonesia, we have senior researcher, Mr. Waffa Kharisma. On Thailand, Professor Cogan wrote the chapter. On Quad, Dr. Satoru Nagao. And on Pacific, our military history team contributed one chapter on this one, leading by Mr. Chris Kolakowski, Captain Brendan Donnelly, Lieutenant Grant Willis, Jose Custodio, and of course, Dr. Leo Mohamed Rubiat and Officer Neil Law. We contributed, we co-authored the 2 chapters in the book. Also, I appreciate our contributors' continued support in updating their chapters. I know there was an update like 2 or 3 times we updated our content, and that's why the book, the information is current, and they updated the content promptly and willingly. Thank you so much to all the contributors. The book centers on the response of Southeast Asian countries to the US-led Indo-Pacific and their foreign policy behavior to the US China competition in the region. As Dr. Leo mentioned, that their strategy to deal with this stiff competition, and some of the parts in the West Philippines that is emerging as a very fragile, that can be triggered conflict anytime. So what the I would be happy to hear the more from our contributors, but what is the in the concluding part, that the Southeast Asian countries, they don't want to pick the side in the US-China competition, but adapting the geopolitical environment. At the same time, they are cautious and finding the way to navigate this. And in that case, they are following the independent foreign policy, or we can say, quote unquote, strategic autonomy or multi-engagement. And therefore, South Asian countries adopted their own ASEAN outlook of free and open Indo-Pacific in 2019, adding some regional and local context. Looking at all these things, like China's BRI, that Indo-Pacific, US launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that the 14 countries are the member of this, and the trade pillar that was not working earlier, it was in the Lushan Economic Corridor. It was started in April 2024, and with the US-Philippines Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement in 2023. So there is a lot has been done in the Biden administrations, but again, this leadership matters in the United States, as we already mentioned in this discussion. We see that new administration is ready to take the charge, and Trump 2.0 is yet to see how the regional countries balance their alliance and partnership with America First rhetoric or Trump's isolationist view. However, leaders from the region expressed their strong willingness for the alliance and partnership and bright future under the President-elect Trump's administration. But we have yet to see what will ahead under the uncertainty, or what is the predictions there's going on, that the many observers and analysts are writing every day in the newspaper and the media. Thank you so much. And Dr. Leo, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Saxena, for putting us together, and especially putting us to write this book. That was a very enjoyable process. And without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker, Professor Mark Cogan. So Professor Mark Cogan is an associate professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Kansai Gaidai University in Osaka, Japan, with expertise in peace building, human rights, and social movements in Southeast Asia, especially in Thailand and Cambodia. His research explores authoritarianism, foreign policy, and security cooperation. Previously, he worked with various UN agencies in communication roles across Asia, Africa, and Middle East, co-founding Thailand's Youth Anti-Corruption Network, recognized by the World Economic Forum. He regularly publishes in outlets like Southeast Asia Globe, Diplomat, and Bangkok Post. So let's welcome Professor Cogan, and please, after your brief talk. Please share your view regarding the prospect under Trump 2.0. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate that. It's interesting to listen to the biography because it feels like so long ago with some of that stuff. But Thailand is very, very complicated because let me say that the Indo-Pacific construct is, as I write in my chapter, relatively new. And Thailand has a hard time operating inside the Southeast Asia construct, if you will, or this geography. And history tells you this. I'm not just talking about, stuff from the 1970s and the sort of communist threat, or, its troublesome territorial borders with Cambodia and which was once Burma, but even in the modern day, because it has a very loose foreign policy. And what I mean by that is that institutions that guide and direct foreign policy are not necessarily in alignment. Some of those being the military. Sometimes when they are, certain institutions do, like when you had a military led government, like the former Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha. There was a very much an exploitative and sometimes later on a cooperative relationship with the Myanmar junta between 2021 and the end of Prayut's term in 2023. So it's very, very important to know that, and how Thailand reacts in the larger Indo-Pacific construct it is very, very complicated. It's extremely complicated. So what I chose to do in my book chapter, which is, I guess, chapter 5, is talk about the how Thailand sees itself, and a little bit also about how Thailand's relationship with major actors in the Indo-Pacific, mainly China, shape their foreign policy. And obviously China is the most important actor, like it is to many other Southeast Asian states. And the thing that is most important is that there is a very, very long history of migration, of trade, military cooperation, and under Prayut, security cooperation that has existed. And this goes back, to the 13th century. And under the old China-dominated hierarchies, Thailand was it understood its place. And then as we sort of went on, there was at times a combative, but still a relatively friendly relationship with China. And there's always been this kind of resonance that China and Thailand are like brothers. And that's kind of true in ways, not in the political context, but in terms of race. A lot of Thai people have Chinese heritage. Thai dishes, many Thai dishes have Chinese origins. A lot of Thai words come from that same part of the world. Huge part of Thai people in the north and northeast are some part Chinese. Even the south, the southern provinces, have large parts that have Chinese heritage to them. So this is a really, really important thing. And it's obvious that trade between the two countries has always been strong. And when, you know, China opened its borders in the 1970s, trade between the countries just sort of grew. And when the book chapter was written, and I know there are a lot of parts that were updated, you know, exports to China, you know, up around 12% annually. You know, it was a, you know, little under $2 billion, you know, 30 years ago, to now over $30 billion. And political discussions are quite common. And the Chinese understand, they're very, very connected to powerful institutions, namely even the Thai monarchy. That relationship is very central. And there are a number of high-level visits. This is key, very, very key to the relationship. The other aspects I think that are really, really important in the Thai-China relationship, and I'm not going to do the Trump thing at the end. That doesn't make sense. So what I'm simply going to do is just going to weave it in. Obviously, we can't anticipate. We never could anticipate that Trump would become president again. Ha ha ha. But in Thailand, for example, I think they know what to expect. So let me give you some insight. So there was a turning point in this relationship between the United States and China with respect to Thailand. You know, and Thailand has a foreign policy that is its own. It doesn't really balance, it doesn't really hedge. There's a famous quote, it has a kind of bamboo diplomacy. It bends with the wind. It's just sort of you know, does whatever the hell it wants to, whatever the political situation or the environment dictates. So a very, very good example of this was a normative approach to dealing with Thailand after the 2014 coup d'etat, which overthrew the Yingluck government in that period. And the Obama administration, sometimes by law and other times through diplomacy and kind of a naming and shaming kind of operation, suspended military ties. It suspended these sorts of routine military exercises like the Cobra Gold exercises. And the discussions about military cooperation, security cooperation, even sort of weapon sales, arms sales, stalled because there's a kind of a law that kind of prevents that from happening. So it's very, very predictable what China will do, or sorry, what Thailand will do. It will go to the Chinese. And under the Prayut government, defense spending, security cooperation, all these things just accelerated. There were talks about buying tanks, armament from the Chinese, talks about getting new generation or updated generations of American fighter jets, stalled, and it actually stalled recently as well. But Thailand had a very, very convenient co-partner or sort of an alternative to Thailand. So it was very easy to sort of bend with the wind when it came to foreign policy or bilateral relations with China. But under a dictatorship, oh, my light went out. Sorry. Under a dictatorship like Prayut Chan-o-cha, the transition when American leadership transferred from Obama to Trump, it wasn't a disadvantage for Thailand on many sides of the of foreign policy, because Trump's relationships with many countries are transactional. And I'm sure that Dr. Nagao, when he was here, he would talk about the transactional kinds of diplomacy. There was a conversation a few years ago about basically Trump saying, hey, you know, you got a good thing going here. How much are you willing to pay for it? You know, how much are you willing to pay for your own security that we, you know, happily pay for, or that was the way it was framed anyway. So the exception was that, like, you know, Japan has to pay more for its own defense, for its own security. So Thailand understood this, and it did what a lot of other countries did. It simply appeased Trump by buying more stuff from Trump. It bought more American weapons. It did this, and it to a certain extent reignited conversations about the purchase of American weapons. And then on the other side of the equation, or the other side of the ball, it started to react in terms of trade. Like, how can we accommodate Trump to not get on his bad side? Because Thailand was, for example, identified as one of those countries that were unfair, so to speak, to the United States. It was perceived to have a kind of a trade deficit that was not necessarily zero sum, I suppose, for American trade policy. So there was an accommodation there. Now, of course, the Thai military and the military government, the Prayut government, is gone. And when this book chapter was written, there was a Putai-led government under the direction of Seta Thavisin, who was thrown out by Thailand's dictatorial constitutional court, which also threw out the party who won the 2023 election, the Move Forward Party, because apparently Thavisin appointed a man who was convicted of a drug crime in Australia, and that was against ethical rules, even though this person was a Thaksin loyalist, and these are very much internal politics. But now we have a government that's led by Ing Shinawat, who is Thaksin's daughter, and there is no reason to believe that the Putai-led government under Ing Shinawat will react any differently to Trump, nor is there any reason to believe that they will react any differently to China the way it had in the past. So in my estimation, that there's going to be absolutely no change. The only thing that will dictate the direction of Thai foreign policy is the surrounding circumstances. Thailand already knows how to deal, and quite adeptly, with great power competition. It has done so for years and years and years, straddling the fence, so to speak, between the great powers during the Cold War, and then the sort of U.S. China supremacy thing in the Asia-Pacific region. So it's going to continue to do that under Ing Shinawat. What complicates things, I suppose, is Thailand's ability to get along with other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. I think that might be a little bit of a challenge. And let me explain that. Changing foreign policy, for example, in Myanmar, because the government had been quite supportive, or they sort of had a personalist relationship with the Tatmadaw and the Tatmadaw military, and the militaries, the Thai militaries and the Tatmadaw have a very sort of unique personalist relationship. Thailand now wants to put that sort of clean up its own mess, so to speak. And as it does so, it's going to run into a little bit of trouble in combating its own interests with those of the Chinese, who are great supporters or have been heavily invested in Myanmar because of its own strategic interests. I see that my time is up, but the general point I think I'm trying to say is that although my chapter is somewhat descriptive and somewhat historical in nature, if I were talking about Trump and the current environment, right? Thailand's foreign policy, that bending with the wind foreign policy, right, is very, very capable of adapting on the fly to changes. And it has already done so under Trump 1.0. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cogan, for your insightful comments and introduction to the chapter that you wrote. And well, the bamboo diplomacy, I would think, oh, this is bamboo shaped water bottle.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah. So that reflects very well with your talk. I do have my questions, but I would like to open the floor for our speakers. Any questions for Professor Cogan? Anyone?
Professor Cogan, I do understand the thing that you mentioned, that there will be no change in respect to the new administration or the earlier Trump's tenure at that time, or the Biden in the middle of that, the Biden administration, with respect to the Thailand. But do you think that Thailand is more kind of inclined to the China, that recently, like 2 weeks ago, the military drill with the Chinese PLA, that Thailand did this? So do you think, like, sometimes I think that there is the military kind of regime, though Thailand is not a military regime, but they are more a kind of inclined to the China, or they don't want to angry China in some sort of things, so that does it make any impact on this competition?
Yeah. So what you were saying makes a lot of sense.
In this competition.
Yeah, you what you're saying actually makes a lot of sense. The point is that Thailand's institutions, right? And we're talking about, if you're talking about civil military relations, that doesn't exist. This is not a professional military. This is a military that it's doing its own thing, and they're almost like it's the wrong word, but it's almost like a parallel institution, right? It's kind of independent. It doesn't function under the control of a civilian government. Those things don't exist, regularly, right? So the military has learned to be kind of independent, and perhaps have a great deal of influence. But let me say that China, the government as a whole, right, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on down, knows how to deal with China. It's very, very good at it. But the cost under the Biden administration was pretty terrible, I think, because, and if I just may say 1 minute, there was a democracy conference. There's this ridiculous thing that there would be this democracy conference. It was a teleconference, and that the United States would invite all these countries to this conference and talk about the importance of democracy in the world, right? And Thailand wasn't invited. It was one of those countries that got snubbed from it. And I wrote about that once or twice, and I said, this is ridiculous. This is absurd, because it's hypocritical. It's incredibly hypocritical, because a lot of the other countries on the list were no shining examples, right? And the United States isn't necessarily the greatest representative of democracy in Southeast Asia. This is ridiculous. So one of the things I said was that back then was, why does it have to be so American-led? Right? Why does a conference on democracy have to be so American-led? Why does it have to be directed by the White House? There are better actors, better relations with Thailand that are better spokespeople for democracy than the Americans. And from a regional perspective, the Japanese are better. The Australians are more consistent on this. At least in the view of the Thai people, who have much better relations, or more firm, just as firm a relationship with Japan and Australia as they do with the United States, not historically, but recently. So the thing is, that story about democracy shows you how wildly American foreign policy sort of shifts, and Thailand is very sort of bending gently with the wind. Right. And there's these hard normative shifts, right, in foreign policy that are ill-advised. You need to be a little bit more pragmatic in dealing with the Thais. And that's one of the reasons why China's relationship and Thai's relationships are much more consistent and much more practiced, because there is a kind of mutual pragmatism, and there's a kind of a special relationship. They just understand each other, and there's a sense of foreign policy continuity. And it's not necessarily because of who's in power. It's just that because there's a common understanding, and it tends to weather shifts or changes or subtle changes in governments or administrations or even ideologies. That makes sense.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Cogan. In the interest of the time, so Waffa, do you want to still ask question? And if you do, please, Professor Cogan, give a very succinct answer.
I'll try to do better.
Right. So thank you, Mark, for your professor, for your I guess presentation. My question is, as I see the pictures coming out of the 8th Greater Mekong Summit that I think there was a couple of days ago, the Thai Prime Minister, shaking hands with Min Aung Hlaing. So of course, as an Indonesian, looking at the I think the way that the sub-Mekong region is, as a collective together, do you for yourself, do you foresee a regional split between the Mekong sub-region vis-a-vis the maritime Southeast Asian countries? Do you foresee that at all in the future? Or do you foresee like a more, it's just going to be a transactional, everything's just going to be fine as a collective, but very thinly, right? So what's your observation?
That's a really great question, and it's a complicated one. And I think what it says, it goes back to my earlier comments about Thailand being able to operate smoothly within its own backyard, and then also within this new Indo-Pacific construct. So when it comes to the Mekong River issue, Thailand, well, it's a Mekong country, but it's a kind of Mekong region country. But there's so many actors at play, and again, Thailand has to balance its relationships with these countries. It's the downstream Mekong River countries, right? Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, my God, that are really, really struggling with this situation. And then, coupled with that, it's the downstream Mekong River countries that are also impacted by the South China Sea issue as well, because this is not just a maritime thing, but this is a food security issue, as is fisheries and ecosystem services, and all these very, very complicated issues. But when then you're talking about Indonesia, which, okay, yeah, sure, it's in the same region, but to a certain extent it's not, because there's less of a connectivity to the broader sort of continental Asia, and that's more complicated. So I think Thailand's relationships with Indonesia and those particular countries continues without reservation or any sort of caution. But Thailand's relationship with the Mekong River countries is certainly heavily influenced by what China's plans are or will be for the Mekong River countries. So I think it's easier for Thailand to navigate the broader Indo-Pacific construct through managing trade relationships, not geopolitics. So that, as it has with I mean, maybe less so now with India, it's a growing trade relationship with Africa, which no one really talks about, and then of course it's growing relationship with Central Asia and the Middle East. So the other, of course, is harder because it's outside the region, is Thailand's difficult relationship with Europe. And here's where Trump comes into play, is that Thailand will probably prefer to strengthen its relationship with the United States over its priority with the European Union, because it prefers a transactional relationship, not a normative one. So the EU's normative guidelines on, let's say, illegal fishing, right, and human rights and migration and all that stuff, Thailand's already going the other way. They're like, forget this. We're going to protect our fisheries. We're going to continue doing business as normal, and Trump won't care about that, right? But the EU will. So there you go.
Well, thank you, Professor Cogan, and thank you for the questions from other speakers. So our next coming up is actually Mr. Muhammad Waffa Kharisma. So he is the researcher at the Center of Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Jakarta, Indonesia. With CSIS, he has worked on a range of research topics on the interaction between geopolitics, sovereignty, and humanitarian issues. For example, the security dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, the role of ASEAN in regional geopolitics, and humanitarian issues. And he graduated from Master of Science from University of Bristol, United Kingdom. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lin, for the time. I'll try to keep it really short, but just trying to make just very general overview of the chapter that we wrote, and also transitioning from what Professor Cogan just said on Thailand's position, because Indonesia's position has been very, I think, for a long time is quite similar, as albeit very differently in terms of our geographical features and how we see Southeast Asia, how we see the relationship between ASEAN countries and great powers. So I think as fellow Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia is also seeing the Indo-Pacific as a region of not just opportunities of connecting markets, but also a region of hotspots and territorial disputes dating back 100, 200 years ago, unfinished. So it's a very different, I guess, situation from Europe. So, and we're packed under one hemisphere, countries with different development and state building path, right? And so Indonesia tends to approach regional geopolitics as not black and white, but we tend to tolerate any violations, or so we tend to not isolate neighbors, right? Because we've got really random neighbors here. If you're looking from a Western perspective, I guess there's so many different regimes here. not so you cannot really put a democratic lens to view in everyone. So one concern is right now, at the very least, is the tit for tat escalations for Indonesia between China and the Philippines. That's something that we're really concerned about, because we know that as a collection of Southeast Asia, as a collection of smaller middle powers, the disparity of power between us and the Chinese are so great, and that the memory of the Cold War era bloc politics and proxy wars are still fresh in our minds, that we still use this as tool to see the current direction of U.S. China competition, right? So when you're looking at the Chinese behavior, which is really concerning for Southeast Asia, but sometimes Indonesia being a post-colonial country, sometimes we also see the behavior of other great powers like the U.S. as also concerning. So that's why one of the key concerns for us is, as a developing nation, is the trajectory of the arms race in the region. So we're not just concerned with the Chinese military buildup, but also AUKUS, right? Because we're one of those countries who have raised hand and say, look, will this be a slippery slope to, a proliferation of, say, nuclear in military settings, right? If not, and of course we're absolutely worried with Chinese, right? Chinese have hypersonic missile systems, 5th generation fighters, carrier killers. And these type of proliferation of arms is in the absence of regional arms control, in a more protectionist, more unilateral world, and double standards in international law. For smaller middle powers, what are our tools, right? What can we use? Is UNCLOS the forefront? The US doesn't sign UNCLOS. The Chinese signed UNCLOS, but they're not really adhering to the principles. What are our tools? So this is a very complicated time for countries like Indonesia. I'll talk about ASEAN later, but really just to keep up and how to protect our interests, right? And Indonesia at this type of time has been seen by the West as a lot of things. It's being seen as a middle power, as a global South country, as a swing state. I think that label has been, uttered before. But one key observation has been, as a democracy, hey, this country, this big democracy, there's a lack of decisiveness for this country. It's as if it's in denial towards the behavior of great powers. It's as if it's in denial of the behaviors of Chinese incursions, because we've got Chinese incursion as well in North Natuna Sea. And it can be hard to understand Indonesia's signals. And I've been to trips to Tokyo, to Washington, and they're so confused with what Indonesia is signaling. Why are you not as strong as India, say, or as at least as active as Vietnam in giving these foreign policy signals? So my key explanation has been the features of Indonesia's foreign policy that you will probably observe as well is, one, Indonesia prefers not to address the actors, but the issues. So if you looked at Indonesia's policy documents, there's rarely any saying of a state actor. Say China as a threat in our white paper. No, we rarely say that. And why? Because historical lessons suggest that Indonesia has been at times cannot afford to make enemies or risk being trapped in a security dilemma. And so these lessons trace back from, because we've got really interesting chapters in our history. Early years of Sukarno were very confrontative. We make wars with Malaysia. We try to play the Soviet against the US. We try to flirt with the Soviet in order to gain more from the US, and then vice versa. And that doesn't end well, right? Because at the end of his time, the West really got concerned with the communist and left-leaning tendencies of Sukarno. Under Suharto, we got really authoritarian, dictator. But at the same time, if there's any one positive thing from his time, is that Indonesia flourishes, our lawyers and diplomats flourishes, that we believe that we contribute a lot to international laws like UNCLOS, right? So there's a complex relations here when there was a time when we were really post-colonial, anti-colonial country, anti-West, anti-imperialism, and then to Suharto, we're really West-leaning. We receive arms from the West. We tried to become an international community members. We were active in international law. So there's this complicated debate that sometimes the other win than the other. And this happens a lot during big debates, like right now in the case of Ukraine war, in the case of say right now, distrust towards the UN and the international law, and these type of things has been coming up here and there in the debate. But the big picture of Indonesia is because we're such a large country in terms of territorial span, but less in terms of assets. For a long time, we see ourselves as not being afford to get trapped into the conflict of another. So our lens has always been inward. Our geopolitical and geostrategic lens is very narrow. We often don't look at Korean Peninsula or Indian Ocean. We looked at just the territorial boundaries of Indonesia. Who's going there? Who's doing the violations? Who's trespassing? Who's not telling us that they're trespassing? So it's a very narrow lens. So that dictates our pragmatism as well. When Indonesia is active, usually it's because that the particular leaders have a taste of, say, international diplomacy, have a taste of international activism. But other than that, at the moment, pragmatism remains the compass. And so this is why Indonesia chose not to name names, I guess, or name and shame, because we cannot afford to make enemies of anyone. So I think a bit of a bamboo diplomacy here as well in that sense. And one key instrument of Indonesia, because of our anxiety with great powers, has been ASEAN, right? We invested so much in ASEAN. For many years, we come up with a lot of documents, and it thrives when ASEAN can say things back to the great powers. When they were proliferating, say, nuclear arms, we're saying, we're saying, no, you cannot do it in Southeast Asia. You cannot proliferate nuclear arms in Southeast Asia. When they're saying, Cold War joining sides and teasing us, tempting us to join sides, we say no. We try to stay in our zone. We try to stay in our block. And please, we have the TAC. We have the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation guiding that. So ASEAN has been thriving, but right now it's a different ASEAN. The big five of ASEAN is strong still, but the other players have come up, right? Vietnam is a strong player. And the five is no longer for me, as in tune as it was back then. I think Thailand has its own things going on with the Mekong countries and the Mekong issues. Indonesia, Singapore relations is complicated. The Philippines have their own emergencies to take care of. So there's this increasingly fractured relationships that I guess for now leaves ASEAN a bit slow in responding to great power politics. So Indonesia is left with the only tool that it has been investing on, ASEAN, fragmented in a time of great power relations. So if you see Indonesia right now, I think under Prabowo, the new administration, I think it will increasingly be about engaging directly to great powers rather than towards this multilateral like ASEAN. So that's my worry as well, because I think he will go straight to China. I think notably a very close, trade partner, but a very irresponsible, neighbor in geopolitically. At the same time, we're still close with U.S., who has been providing us with security umbrella and military assets, but at the same time, she's also inconsistent in terms of their presence. So we're stuck with this two great powers. Not all of them pay attention to Indonesia as much as we want, but increasingly we're also being trapped in an ASEAN that is less responsive. So this is the condition of Indonesia under the U.S. China rivalry in the modern context. So you will see in recent days, Indonesia joining BRICS, but also earlier in the year we're also trying to join OECD. Of course, we kept flirting with different blocks of power as our new way of dealing with great power relations. So I don't know if it's a step up or if it's, but I think it's also a reaction to what happens at the regional level, Southeast Asia level, where there's a bit of a stagnancy at the ASEAN. So I think you'll be seeing a lot more than that, a lot more of that. Probo is right now is visiting Beijing. Then he will go to the U.S. I think for us in Indonesia, it'll be interesting to look at the statement that come out of the deals that kind of come out of the meeting. And that would be a great interest to Southeast Asians as well. So yeah, I'll end there.
Okay, thank you very much, Waffa. And so I think Indonesia is positioned in a very strategic area where it's in between Australia and like in the continental Southeast Asia and the U.S. And so you mentioned you used the word trapped. Is it the word that you used? So that was part of my question. So if I can take the liberty, so can you kind of very briefly explain why you think that Indonesia is in a trap in this sense? Sorry about I take the lead to ask the question. Thank you. Very briefly, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. So I think Indonesia will be doing all right if we're just in a status quo, right? Because we're a non-aligned country where we have a free and active doctrine. We have, I guess we haven't declared any enemies. We kept a favorable relations with both the Chinese and the U.S. We try to balance our relations as much as possible. So we're good. But the thing is, we want to step up as well in terms of our ambition. The government wants to eradicate poverty. We want to get higher in the supply chain. We want to not just export our natural resources, but at least a refined version of those resources. So we want to step up in the supply chain. You can see this in the EV ecosystem, the electric vehicle ecosystem, where Indonesia is really pushing for a downstreaming policies, right? When I say trapped, it's because I think, and I think this happened a bit, I think was during the first Trump, I guess, era, where there was trade war and decoupling. I think Indonesia felt a bit left behind when the most of the benefits of decoupling doesn't come to Indonesia. So factories coming out of China is not necessarily coming to Indonesia. It comes to Malaysia, it comes to Vietnam, it comes to Thailand, and of course a lot of these numbers are stagnating, right? And then we got COVID, where we had to secure vaccines fast, and the only publicly available, I guess, aid back then was the Chinese vaccines. And so we were increasingly, I guess, when I said trapped with limited options, right? Because of those eras during Trump era, plus during COVID, when the Chinese were basically one of the very early options, plus added with, I think what was discussed before, under Biden was high labor standards, green standards, which is really hard for Indonesians to keep up with in terms of industries as a developing nation. Our relations with the EU is quite tough as well because of palm oil. So the options are really limited. It's just China at the moment, like the big one, right? Japan is also there. Koreans are also there, but they have their own thing. Korean have the North Korea issues right now. Japan, domestic politics is a bit tricky. But we're left with just China. So we, as a country who wants to balance things, we're increasingly trapped. And our old answer usually was ASEAN. But right now, ASEAN is so fragmented that I fear that it might fail us in terms of buffering against the Chinese domination, or I guess strong domination. I'm great friends with the Chinese as well, because we met a lot. But we know as developing countries, you have to balance entanglements, right? And so this is the worry. That's what I mean by being trapped. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Waffa, for your elaboration. I saw Brandon say hand. Thank you. Please go ahead.
No worries going first. Still good to hear that conversation. So wanted to say at least that I really enjoyed your chapter in the book. So this is kind of a continuation off of some of the topics that you talked about tonight and then in the chapter as well. So my intention is kind of figuring out your perspective on the balance between Indonesia, China, and the United States. So do you think that the maritime disputes that you'd been talking about before with the Chinese and the Philippines, is there a limit to where Indonesia won't kind of try to play only issues? Will there ever be a return to if China does this kind of aggressive action against the Philippines or to the Indonesians, is there a sway to the United States, or vice versa? Is there something that the United States would do that would then have Indonesia sway a little bit more towards supporting China instead?
Thank you. I think that's a really great question because I've been pondering that myself in terms of the threshold, right? For the Chinese, I think unfortunately, Indonesia has been quite pragmatic. So the turning point will be if the Chinese are aggressive against Indonesia at this moment. So if they're really aggressive in the North Tuna Sea, if their interaction escalates to, say, for example, just like what the Philippines are doing, they're shooting at, say, Indonesian Coast Guard ships. Right now, it hasn't happened yet, that type of crisis. But it might, if that happens and it went viral, it might trigger domestic sentiments, nationalist sentiments inside Indonesia, which has been, because of, history with communism and that there's still a deep-seated wariness inside the Indonesian populations with the Chinese, right? So if that happens and it went viral, Indonesians rise up, demonstration, I think Indonesia would get tough on China. And it might not necessarily lead to, for example, Indonesia is actively pursuing alliance with the US, but it will entertain more, for example, Quad products, or entertaining more collaboration with maybe not the US per se, but Australia and Japan. So and that would be less aggressive toward the Chinese, but it will signal something that look, we're not accepting this. We gotta play with other partners to, I guess, deter or balance what you're doing, and we need to safeguard ourselves. So that's the Chinese side. The US side, of course, because of the virtue of proximity, we tend to see US less as hostile because they're so far away. But of course, we have histories of, I guess, violations as well with the US ships. Mostly, perhaps from the US side, their perspective is not violations because it's according to international law, and that's what the US argument is. But usually, Southeast Asian countries, littoral straits, we want information. We want due regards of our rights as a littoral state. So if you want to pass around, you have to kind of tell us what the assets are, how many are there, and there has been incidents where the information doesn't match, and there was some tensions with the Americans. I think the last one was 2003. There was a incident with involving, I guess, fighter jets from the US side. So something that violates Indonesia's sovereign rights, that would be troublesome. The other one would be if there is incendiary remarks or I guess a behavior from the US side that triggers a Chinese response, because that would be put us in an awkward position as well. Or from Australian side, if they were the ones that projects powers, that they escalate their power projections before the Chinese, that would be put us in an awkward position as well. Whether should we stay neutral? Should we let them through, for example, or should we protest? So that's something that could be put us a bit more to the Chinese side if the aggression comes from this side before the Chinese. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Waffa, and thank you, Brandon, for the question. And in the interest of time, let's move on to our next speaker. So it's gonna be Dr. Chris Kolakowski. So Chris is currently director of the Wisconsin Veteran Museum in Madison, Wisconsin, a member of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs Review Board, and a senior fellow, the lead member of the consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers Military History Team. Prior to his position at the Wisconsin Veteran Museum, he served as director of the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. So I visited there several times. I lived in Maryland to Australia, a very beautiful place. And the director of the General George Patton Museum and Center of Leadership in Fort Knox, Kentucky. So that's welcome, Chris. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leo. Great discussion so far. And what I want to do in my remarks is I'm fortunate that I have several of the authors, co-authors of the chapter that we did, which is What is Old is New Again. And one of the things that we in the military history team try and do is we recognize Asia is an area that has a long memory. In fact, in many ways, to understand where we are and some of the dynamics that are at play, particularly in Southeast Asia, you have to have some understanding of what has gone before. As a matter of fact, in one of these panel discussions earlier this year, I had a Bangladeshi retired lieutenant general say, "We are being strangled by history," when he was talking about some of his country's relations with various parts of Southeast Asia. So I start by framing that as kind of we looked at our chapter from the perspective of that history. What is that history, particularly that history since the United States has been involved in a major military way in Asia, really for the last 125 years or so since the Boxer Rebellion. And so what does that say, and what factors might be influencing, as we think about where we're going? And so, when you think about it, certainly since the Boxer Rebellion, which since the United States War of Independence was the first war the United States fought with foreign allies afterwards. So, from 1783, the end of that war, all the way until the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, the United States didn't fight a conflict with a foreign ally until the Boxer Rebellion. And really, it has never stopped. It has never stopped being engaged in Asia in some way as part of a coalition to either protect the peace or to defeat a rising Asian power that was threatening the peace or disrupted the peace, or to create kind of the construct or the security architecture to manage Asian geopolitics. The United States has been at the table for that long, like I said, a century and a quarter. And it's built some very strong allies. And I'm going to let my colleagues talk about some of those, particularly Japan. I know Brendan is going to talk about that. Jose Custodio, who could not join us this evening, talked about his native country, the Philippines, which I will talk about here in just a second. And then one of the other factors that is less well appreciated, but has been demonstrated over and over again, really since the Pacific War in World War II, the World War II in the Pacific, is the importance of air power. Most people, when they think of the Indo-Pacific, think immediately, and particularly Southeast Asia, think immediately that it's a naval theater because of the amount of water, which is understandable. But in many ways, those distances, the best way to project power, the best way to manage those distances and dominate those distances quickly is by air power. And that's a whole presentation for a whole of the time, the case studies of air power in Pacific warfare. But suffice it to say that that is an underappreciated asset. And so when we look at what the United States, how the United States has participated as part of alliances, part of coalitions, and now in many ways has, since World War II in the last 80 years, has constructed an alliance structure to kind of ensure that there is a relative stability in Asia. And now with the rise of China, that stability is under threat. And so it's from that perspective, looking back on what does the history tell us, but also what does this tradition of alliances tell us about, as we think about where we're going, what are some of the key factors that might influence everything? And so our chapter includes a discussion of air power, obviously discussion of the Philippines, and discussion of Japan. Before I talk about the Philippines, I will address Leo's question regarding the recent U.S. election and the re-election of Donald Trump. And I will point out, one of the earlier speakers commented that it, based on the first term, it was bilateral. The approach was much more bilateral from Trump, and it was much more transactional. I agree with both of those assessments. However, I would add this caveat. Quad did not go away. He did not make a move to kill Quad. So it raises an interesting question about what motivates those transactions, what motivates that perspective. And some of it might be related to personality. I know one of the reasons the Trans-Pacific Partnership, President Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership so fast, it was because it was a direct strike against his predecessor, who had worked very hard to create the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it has since been replaced by something else to some degree. So you have to wonder how much of it with President Trump is personal, how much of it is he's an adherent of personal diplomacy. You saw that a lot in his first term. I see no reason to believe that won't change in his second term. I guess the only thing that I would say with any certainty is there's going to be some uncertainty. But I also am not sure how much uncertainty there's going to be, because again, some of it was transactional, some of it was bilateral, but some multilateral structures like Quad remained and continued to operate even during the first Trump administration. So time will tell. Time will tell on that front. With regard to the Philippines, one of the things, Jose spent a fair amount of time talking about the alliance with the United States after the Philippine independence in 1946. Of course, the Philippines was a U.S. colony after being wrested from the Spanish after the war with Spain. And Jose spent a lot of time talking about why is the United States continuing to have an alliance? Why is the treaty still a treaty ally today? Part of it is those historical ties to a former colony. Part of it is geostrategic. And Jose spent some time talking about how really the Philippines, the state of the Philippine military, for all of the exercises, for all of the things that are going on, the Philippine military, the greatest asset that it can provide the United States is bases. And that's what Jose's basic argument. And recently, some of the new agreements and the expanded basing agreements, you're starting to see a real understanding of that on the part of the Filipinos. Of course, they're not the United States is not the only one that recently had an administration change. Of course, with the election of the Marcos administration, which is much more pro-Washington than Duterte, which was much more pro-Beijing. However, Marcos's vice president is President Duterte's daughter. And there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of internal conflict about that as well. But nonetheless, right now, the winds are blowing toward Washington. The winds from Manila are blowing toward Washington. But we'll see how that develops. Just as U.S. domestic politics may very well impact the Trump administration's approach to Asia in the next few years, so may Philippine domestic politics, and particularly that division, but it seems to be ever growing between the president and the vice president, may impact relations both with Beijing and with Washington as well. So time will tell, but I think there's, at least right now, there's a significant legacy and a significant structure in place that are assets and a good coalition in place for the United States to work with and through going forward. And so I'll defer to my co-authors on their pieces, but I did at least want to cover those essential points to kind of frame the rest of the discussion of our chapter.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for your intro not only to the chapter and also cover Jose's part as well. Much appreciated. Any questions from our speakers?
I was that thorough, I guess, huh?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think you explained it very clearly. So, Chris, I do have a question for you. So, from the history, especially military history point of view, what do you think that under Trump, because during Trump's campaign, he would like to end many wars, some wars in 24 hours. Well, the approach is that he's showing that he's very capable of through various means to end like warfares, not only in the region that we're talking about in the Southeast Asian region, but along the other regions. So what's your interpretation and your take on this based on the history that you learned from the past?
I think Trump puts a lot of stock in his personal diplomacy, and that's what you're asking about. I was getting at in when I made that allusion to personal diplomacy. My study of military history, and I actually represented the consortium at a panel on how the Ukraine war might end a few weeks ago, and how it's a lot easier to start a war than it is to end one, and it is let's put it this way. The promise to end the Russo-Ukraine war in 24 hours with a few phone calls is long on proposal, very short on details. I have never seen an instance in history where that's happened. And particularly when you're dealing with complicated issues like you are there, like you are in the Middle East, like you would, like you are negotiating the end of, a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, a détente between, an increased détente between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, name a conflict in Asia. It is very difficult to do that, particularly when you've got some of these long, deep roots of conflict going back into history. And do I want to see peace everywhere? Yes. Do I want to see, resolution of these conflicts? Yes. Is it going to be that easy? Well, if it was, it would have been done already. And so that's what my study of history teaches me. And we'll see how it all plays. He's going to try. We'll see what comes of it.
Well,
Yeah, I
thank
guess
you. Yes, please.
I guess, Chris, he started already, like he made a call to President Zelensky, and Elon Musk was also on the call.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah. We'll see. We shall see.
Well, thank you. But I think the common ground is that it is really a complex issue to end any type of wars. Well, in those hotspots, like in Russia-Ukraine war, in East Asia, in the Middle East, and well, it's very challenging for Trump administration. Well, even though this is his like a second time, he's pretty familiar with many things already. But well, in terms of personal diplomacy to end a war in 24 hours, well, I agree with you. It's very challenging to do so. But we'll see what's going to happen.
Lyndon Johnson saw himself as a deal maker and thought if he was able to push Ho Chi Minh in a certain direction militarily, he could sit down and make a deal with him, just like he could when he was in Congress, when Johnson was in Congress. And of course, we all know how that turned out. So I'm not necessarily predicting one thing or another, but that is, as I think about case studies of history and potential lessons to learn, that's one to consider.
Right, thank you very much, Chris. So let's move on to our next speaker. So it's gonna be Captain Brendan Donnelly. So Captain Donnelly is a U.S. Air Force officer, and he's also a fellow with the consortium of the Indo-Pacific researchers. He's a graduate of Bowling Green State University, where he achieved a BAS in history with a dual minor of political science and aerospace leadership. He has multiple publications with the consortium and with the Journal for Indo-Pacific Affairs. Captain Donnelly has also been featured as a moderator and speaker on the Vanguard Indo-Pacific podcast and presented at academic panels on behalf of the consortium as well. So the floor is yours, Captain Donnelly.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. And also, I wanted to take this time to also thank Dr. Indu and Mr. Chris Kolakowski. The opportunity to contribute to this book has been absolutely incredible. So thank you for having me here. Purely because I'm going to hit the Trump question and the U.S. and China relations question, I have to put in the disclaimer that as an Air Force officer, and this also would cover for Grant as well, both of our opinions are our own academic opinion and are not the official statement or position of the U.S. military. Have to put in there regardless of whatever we say. So to talk about my short section in chapter 7 for the book, like Chris has already talked about, we focused on the history of the Indo-Pacific. And so I start very briefly talking about the relationship between the Japanese and the United States just after World War II, how that rebuilt, and kind of where we are ending up today. And so then after that, it is then leading up to the reinterpretation of the Japanese Constitution, Article 9 in 2021. So I loved the introduction from Dr. Nagao because he kind of touches a little bit on that in particular topic that I wanted to hit on, which was the question was asked, will Japan protect Taiwan and support Taiwan? And so that's one of the pieces that was reinterpreted in Article 9. Was the Japan committed to safeguarding and supporting Taiwan if China's aggression actually takes place? And so that was a huge shift from what happened previously. And then in the chapter, then I move into kind of what we've been almost talking about, but I want to contextualize a little bit, is China's phases of operations and kind of how they've been expanding. And briefly speaking, there are about 3 phases whenever China expands anywhere. There's the normalization of their presence. So that is either maritime, either personnel in the area. We see this also often in Africa as well, South America, where the presence is just known, and it's now becoming a normalized thing where it's not a huge deal if there's additional people that are sent there, military and non-military forces, which then leads into phase 2, which is where there's a shift in trying to maintain control of either areas, maritime locations, or even if that is air defense identification zones. And then phase 3 is where it's total control. There's actually force behind making the actual exercisation of control as well. So that's kind of bits and pieces of that have already been talked about this evening. And so those are kind of the 3 phases that I focus on in the chapter. That being said, I also specifically hit on Senkaku Islands as well as one of those other disputed territories between the Japanese and China. So not only with the reinterpretation of Article 9, Japan also has its own territorial dispute between China as well. So there's another kind of weight in the fire as well. And then I also talk about, which Chris has already was mentioning with the location with the Philippines, the United States would need basing locations, and I know that Grant is going to be talking about land-based air power. But to touch on that, not to take over for him, but Japan realistically is going to be one of the closest locations for U.S. assets to be taking off from if there was any kind of need to support and defend Taiwan. And then, as Dr. Nagao also said, is if the United States is going to be launching U.S. assets from Japanese soil, then that would also probably bring in the Japanese military as well. And so I briefly talk about the capabilities from the Japanese military and what they could bring to the fight and why they're so important. Towards the end, I have small clips to basically for the sake of space in the book, but I talk about AUKUS a little bit, the uses of national instruments of power from the Japanese and the Japanese military. So that's at least my portion of the chapter. Specifically to Dr. Lin's questions, first off with the Trump re-election one is, I know Dr. Nagao mentioned that Trump is kind of like a wild card, but I think voicing both Dr. Nagao's position and working with Chris's position as well, of that there is going to be some unknowns, but there is also going to be some knowns. I think that is a key piece, is regardless if Kamala Harris won or if Trump won, there is going to be some kind of uncertainty, which is itself a deterrent, is you don't exactly know what the new president is going to do. that's where I kind of lead into answering the U.S. relationship question a little bit. It's because I think what's likely going to happen with Trump now is the Chinese are going to kind of poke and prod a little bit, potentially sending military forces into the ADIZ, potentially disregarding some international maritime norms, just to see what President Trump is going to do. And that reaction, I think, is going to really inform what U.S. and Chinese relations are going to look like over the next couple of years. The other piece that I wanted to talk about non-military wise is depending on what President Trump's economic plan is going to be. I can't assume what that is, but based off of what has been presented so far, is that could be quite aggressive economic actions taken against China. If those types of things do occur, then I think since that, I mean, it's a combating economy between the United States and China. If there are some more aggressive economic actions that are taken against China, then the U.S. and Chinese relationship is going to go down. That was also one of the reasons why I asked the question before about Indonesia and the United States, is because I keyed in specifically on the comment that if the United States starts one of these more provocative actions against China, then that puts Indonesia at a weird place. And so if President Trump has aggressive economic policy against China, then that immediately will then likely impact Indonesia as well. And that was a point that I wanted to make. And so then the last point that I think actually Dr. Indu very briefly mentioned is the relationship and the communication that's already been happening in Europe, is the communication between Trump and President Putin, depending on how that goes. If there is actually a drawdown, if President Trump and Vladimir Putin are working to draw down the war in Ukraine, I'm not sure what that's going to look like from the Chinese, but that is going to be a significant issue, is if the relationship between Trump and Xi Jinping and Putin, that trifecta is going to be something going to be there very interesting. If between Trump and Putin things degrade even further, I think it's likely that the relationship between the U.S. and China will also, in a similar fashion, also degrade as well. So I think that sufficiently touches on the question. So pending any questions, happy to be here and happy to answer anything.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Thank you. That was very insightful and very clear. I saw, so Captain Willis has a question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Brendan, awesome presentation there. I just had a quick question about the Japanese Navy. There's a couple articles out now about the Japanese helicopter destroyer being used as a F-35 aircraft carrier with the name Kaga, which is an interesting choice for a name for that show. It's appropriate, I think. But U.S. Marine F-35 squadron doing trials on the flat top now. How do you see that as a step forward with Japan's possible combat power it can bring to a Taiwan scenario? Do you see them building more of these platforms and converting more of their platforms to be quasi carriers?
I will answer your question and another piece that I want to bring into that. So I think the F-35 brings up an interesting piece because the integration of that platform takes time. So I think, first off, in order to meet the timeline of 2027, 2028, I would say yes, it is very likely that the Japanese are going to be increasing their own intercapability with F-35s. Potentially, that could either be land-based or that could be modifying any of their naval vessels to do so. So if that answers your question very directly, but that brings me to a different point that I wanted to make very quickly, is for those that might be listening or for those that are on the call that haven't seen the comparison between the F-35 and the J-35, the Chinese fifth generation fighter, I paused there because I want you to go look at those pictures. They're near identical. So I think that also pushes the Japanese even further to completely integrate the F-35. because if the J-35 has now just been implemented in the Chinese military, in the PLAAF, it's going to take them a few years to get completely trained on the new system, on all the new parts and pieces to the platform. The Japanese are going to want to have even more experience with the F-35 before 2027. So I think that's an additional push for why the Japanese should be modifying all of their pieces to the military as well. So great question, Grant.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Captain Willis, for your question and a very direct answer to Grant's question. Any other questions? So I have a question for you, Brendan. Since Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, so China has constantly used their fighter jets to go around the air defense identification zone surrounding Taiwan. So what's your take on the future or possible future development on this? And because it's gonna be a new normal now, or it's gonna change, or going back to their original status. And also on like J35, I'm not an expert on this, but as I know that the function of J35 is a lot inferior. It's not as capable as F-35, and it's very like a shortened takeoff, and it's very good quick takeoff. But it has less like a capability compared to F-35. So I wonder if that's for I wonder the application of this fighter jet. Does it connect to their through their the operations surrounding Taiwan Strait, or there's another use for that? So it's kind of general general question for the second one. Thank you.
Appreciate both parts. So I'll take the first part about the air defense identification zone. So first off, the J-35 isn't usually a part of those incursions, but I think they have been steadily increasing, and then there have been a couple of massive jumps, especially when Pelosi also went over to Taiwan. I don't think that we're going to see a large increase of aircraft that are going to be around there, like the Chinese exercises usually are. There's usually a naval presence that's also kind of around the maritime borders of Taiwan, and then there's also a significant number of aircraft. Absolute personal opinion, I think these are going to steadily increase as we see potentially what the Chinese think that they would require for a total invasion of Taiwan. Is once we continuously see and these 80s incursions increase, and once we start seeing them plateau, my mind thinks they've now reached the level at which they are coordinated, doing joint operations between the air and sea, and they've reached the level of doing it that will total the number of assets that they think they will require for at least the first initial push if they were going to militarize and invade Taiwan. So I think that's my perspective on the first part. It's a difficult question to answer about the J-35. Even though it is projected as less capable, I couldn't trust that information. I personally would think that the Chinese are going to purposely hide that platform as much as possible, just how the United States perchance also hides details about the B-21. So our strategic bomber that we're developing, the newest and greatest aircraft from the Chinese, they are going to try to undersell as best as possible, I think, is a way of doing some kind of information operation and making it seem as though, oh, this isn't that big of a threat. That way, maybe it's not as a serious, incredible thing for the United States to combat against. But then, once things actually pop off, if and when there is any kind of incursion from a J-35, I think the scariest part would be if after an incursion ends, but we didn't actually see it with the J-35. That stealth capability, if we are informed of it afterwards, will be the big tick that I think will be the spark in being like, oh dang, this thing is actually a lot more capable. So I'm very curious how they're going to use it. I think like the F-35, I don't think it's going to be much of a dogfighter, but any kind of stealth operation or long range type of engagement is going to be that platform's kind of main mission. So I'm curious to see what it's going to look like and how they use it as they integrate it into their own military capabilities.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Brandon, for answering those two questions very to the point, very directly, and thank you for your info as well. So this is my concern as well, because most people they don't even know the difference about the basic difference about those two type of jets, and while not mentioning to the application of those two jets. So thank you very much. Let's move on to our last but not the least speaker, Captain Grant Willis. Captain Willis is an U.S. Air Force officer and a fellow with the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. He's a distinguished graduate of the University of Cincinnati with a BA in International Affairs with a minor in Political Science. He has multiple publications with the Consortium United States Naval Institute Proceedings and a Naval History Magazine, Air Force Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, and Air University's Wild Blue Yonder Journal. He's also a featured guest on multiple episodes on Vanguard Indo-Pacific at the official podcast of the consortium and the CIPR conference, panel lectures available on consortium's YouTube channel as well. So the floor is yours, Captain Willis.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Lin, and thank you everybody for coming here tonight and just for the opportunity to be a part of this team and be a part of this publication. It's a great honor for me, and I know that me and Brendan and I have had a great opportunity with this book publication to work with the military history team at CIPR under Chris's leadership. It's been absolutely outstanding. So my section of the chapter, Old is New Again, really focuses on context and consequences, right? I mean, the title of that section, Consequences with Context, there really tries to take the reader into some of those World War II in the Indo-Pacific lessons from air power, and specifically what happens when air power fails on the ground, and then what happens when it works right. And in this case, in 1941, we look beyond the disaster at Pearl Harbor for the U.S. Pacific Fleet being destroyed there with the combined force being caught on the ground with the Hawaiian Air Forces. That disaster really multiplied itself in the Far East in the U.S. Outpost in the Philippines, which had the largest concentration of American air power outside the continental United States in the form of the Far East Air Forces. Them being caught on the ground on December 8th, 1941, and being virtually destroyed very quickly in the campaign set General MacArthur up for a more difficult campaign to fight on the ground, as well as the U.S. naval forces, the Asiatic fleet, having to bug out and go south towards the Dutch East Indies very quickly, and having those submarine forces being dispersed without any sort of air cover. You can't hit what you can't see, and not having that air power there forward really limited the reconnaissance capability that the U.S. Had out there to actually hit and interdict targets as the Japanese supernova of expansion expanded across the Pacific in December 41. So really what that section is looking at what happens to air power when it's caught on the ground. And when air power is caught on the ground, it's not air power anymore. It's just a pile of junk, burning junk on the ground. It has no value now. So with the other aspect of World War II, what we like to take a look at now is the Japanese use of effective land-based air power against naval assets, specifically Force Z, the HMS Prince of Wales, and Repulse, the battle group being caught off of the Malayan coast by land-based bombers. And although doctrinal practice of the day had stated, hey, we have organic anti-aircraft capability, we have anti-aircraft batteries that can defend ourselves, we don't need fighter cover, they found out very quickly that they needed fighter cover. The Japanese twin-engine bombers basically put them onto the bottom, and it was one of the most disastrous moments in the Royal Naval history when that battle force was sent to the bottom of the sea. So it goes to show you that dynamic between land-based air power being utilized in a negative way and in a lesson-learning way from the Americans and the Far East Air Forces in the Philippines, as well as the Japanese use of land-based air power being used correctly to interdict shipping and naval power to dictate the will against the enemy. That is really the beginning part of that section of the chapter that I like to focus on. And then I like to move and segue into the Cold War, where the Americans displaying forward air power and that basing capability that a lot of people have talked about already today, with the American basing in the Philippines and Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, as well as in Vietnam, basing forward in the Cold War against the Communist Chinese under Mao Zedong, and the various clashes that happened with Taiwan in 1954, 1958, and then later on in 1996 as well as a key moment. But what we like to focus on in this chapter is 1958, the second Taiwan crisis, in which you had a lot of stuff going on in the world at that time. You had movement in Europe. You had a lot of strategic tension in Europe at the time between the Soviet Union and the United States. You had some rift going on between the People's Republic of China under leadership of Mao, as well as the Soviet leadership in 1958 under Nikita Khrushchev. And then you also had turmoil in the Middle East, where you had U.S. Marines hitting the beaches near Beirut in Lebanon. You also had a coup in Iraq in 1958, in which the British had to respond by sending an intervention force to Kuwait to possibly stave off an Iraqi invasion there. So you had multiple crises going on at the same time that potentially led Mao to determine that now was a good time to face off against the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, under Taiwan, as well as the offshore islands that are still under nationalist control at that time. So you had an increase of artillery exchanges, increasing bombardment and sieges there. You had air action between the Republic of China Air Force supplied by the United States, using technology for the first time against Soviet-supplied MiG aircraft that the People's Liberation Army Air Force was using. Really, that crisis buildup prompted a composite air strike force from the United States Air Force, as well as elements from the United States Navy and Marine Corps, to forward deploy atomic assets to place in position under Op Plan 2558 to be ready to intervene against mainland targets, against the People's Liberation Army Air Force air bases, infrastructure that were critical to the survival of the communist state there out of Beijing, as well as basically interdict and deter the PLA from further action in invading some of those offshore islands. So really, what that provided, in my personal opinion, to the Chinese leadership today as they develop their military capabilities in the Pacific is to analyze situations like that. Analyze situations like 1941. How can you catch American air power on the ground? How to utilize land-based air power against naval shipping, for the example of Force Z off the Malayan coast. And then furthermore, how do I deter the Americans from building up that combat power in my theater immediately within the geographic location that I'm trying to force my will on a national objective, like the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland? How do I stop the Americans from building up that combat power based off of the lessons learned from 1991 and Desert Storm? Some of the things that the PLA, institute now that we hear a lot about are land-based missiles. Land-based missile technology to hold American aircraft carriers at bay. Some of the lessons that they've taken from that obviously stem around the various crises, 1954, 1958, as well as 1996, where they've had to develop that capability to keep those carriers back if they were to execute that order to take Taiwan and execute that amphibious invasion. They're going to have to keep those American carriers away. And then also, how are we going to mitigate that American air power on the ground that's already stationed there? And how are we going to deter and keep away and interdict that American air power that's going to come into places like the Philippines, places like Australia, places like Okinawa, different places across the home islands of Japan? How do we interdict that and keep that from coming at us when we're trying to secure our national objectives? And one of the things that they've also looked at too is, hey, what did the Soviets do during the Cold War that we can try and emulate in the Soviet anti-carrier doctrine, where they're utilizing missile-carrying submarines? They're using long-range naval aviation to try and interdict American aircraft carriers and convoys coming across the North Atlantic and the North Sea, as well as in the North Pacific. Well, the Chinese geographically have a different scenario that they have to deal with, where they have multiple axes of American aircraft carriers and American air power that can stage from multiple points along the different island chains across the Pacific, from the first island chain, second island chain, all the way back to the continental United States. So they have a dilemma on their hands. And one of the things that we have to look for in the West and we have to look for in the United States, especially amongst the officer corps, amongst those in Indo-PACOM, is how are we going to respond to their innovation and their capability to interdict some of the assets that we've enjoyed using for the past 80 plus years, like our carrier aviation? How are we going to mitigate that and still provide that capability to support our allies forward within the first island chain and provide effects to deter the PLA from executing that D-Day-like invasion, where they will have to gain air superiority, where they will have to cordon off the location of the amphibious assault as the U.S. forces and allied forces come in to Taiwan's aid, if that is the order to do so. So with that, there's a lot more memory in the People's Liberation Army as well. I think Chris hit on this. This is a region that's steeped in historical memory. I mean, you have American naval action at the Battle of the Pearl River Forts in 1856 during the Second Opium War, all the way through to the various crises over Taiwan, even 1991 in Desert Storm, where the PLA and that Chinese weight of memory are able to categorize American capability throughout the years and determine what they need to do in order to mitigate that so that they can secure their national objectives. So with that, I think I'm going to end it there and open it up for any questions that you guys might have there.
Thank you very much, Gray, for your very insightful analysis, especially from historical point of view, regarding the Chinese military history and as regards to Taiwan and the neighboring situation. Any questions for Grant? Well, I have a very short question for you. So you mentioned about amphibious invasion from China. So what's the requirement for Chinese PLA to launch amphibious invasion, especially under the new administration?
Well, I appreciate the question there. I think in regards to the incoming administration, I'll keep it brief on that. As far as what the National Command Authority decides to do if that situation were to come about, again, personal academic opinion, we won't know. You just don't know unless you have you're a fly on the wall inside that National Security Council meeting in the war room there. So we just don't know how that's going to happen. We do have the Taiwan Relations Act that mandates the Department of Defense to be prepared to assist Taiwan, but we just won't know how the president-elect, the new commander-in-chief, is going to execute anything like that if there was an invasion. So there's that portion of it. But the second part of your question there, as far as what the PLA will need to do, I like to look at the PLA as not what the PLA can march down Red Square, what they can produce in the parade. I think a lot of people look at the Red Army and they are fearful of the size. But what I like to remind people is that the PLA is only as large as what they can put on the beach and sustain, right? And how much equipment, how much logistic staging that's going to require. I mean, you look at an operation like Operation Overlord and D-Day, you have the American 8th Air Force with the 9th Air Force and the Royal Air Force working in combined bomber offensive and airstrikes over a period of years to prep the battle space for that execution of the invasion. The PLA will not have that sustained air campaign to basically win that air superiority before they launch their amphibious assault. They're going to have to work in tandem together at the same time, or at least that's what I would predict that they were going to do. Because if you launch an air campaign over a long period of time against the Americans and the alliance, you're going to put yourself into a bind without executing that amphibious assault very quickly. So they're going to have to gain air superiority at the same time they're going to have to launch their amphibious invasion. They're going to have to work with deception. They're going to have to pre-stage a lot of units. They're going to have to produce a lot of combat power on the beachhead with a lot of fire support all at the same time and coordinate that. And it's going to be a very difficult fight. We often look at the PLA as this large giant and this dragon to slay, but what we often do not look at is what is going to be required for them to do that, and the amount of shipping, the amount of amphibious assault ships they're going to have to gather, the amount of escort ships that they're going to have to position to defend that, how much air power they're going to have to dedicate to not only defend the naval assets that have to provide that combat power forward, but also how are they going to provide close air support with ground forces that are landing in an amphibious manner for the first time in their combat history. How are they going to do that? They're going to have to practice that sort of thing. And you're going to have to see over time how that joint force capability increases in the PLA and how confident they are in their own capabilities to actually execute if President Xi gives the thumbs up. They're going to have to be pretty confident in how they produce joint fires. So it's another we shall see. Hope not, but we shall see.
Well, thank you very much, Rain. So we mentioned the practice and the logistic, like issues and what comes after. So that would involve a lot of resources and manpower and energy, or a lot of like effort has to put it before they would like to do any amphibious invasion. Well, thank you very much for your input. Any other questions before we conclude? So thank you very much again, everyone, for spending the past 2 hours and for this book talk. It was a very wonderful learning process for me as well. And now I would like to conclude by thanking everyone, and I would like to turn the mic back to Indu, please, Dr. Indu.
Thank you, Dr. Leo, and thank you everyone for this insightful perspectives. And we not only touched on our chapters, but insightful analysis. So that, and of course, some new arguments that that to work on, and maybe we hope to announce our second volume, because now there is a new administration, some of the certainty and uncertainty that we discussed here, and there are some new thoughts that are coming up. Our new volume soon with the different perspectives and maybe the different titles. But again, it has been 6 months that our book is in the market, and we have been receiving a lot of appreciations regarding the content, regarding authors' contributions, and about the topic, of course, and the cover page. So totally, we did a good job as a team. Thank you again, Leo, for taking us these 2 hours and making this a worth discussion. It's kind of Chris. I think it's kind of mini conference that we did here today. They spent 2 hours of the time, and literally from the Indo-Pacific, from Sydney to the Jakarta to Japan, Tokyo, and we touched upon each chapters, each topic and issues, from Mekong to Taiwan, and from Quad to AUKUS. And listeners, for the listeners, we will share the video who are not able to join at this point. they can watch the video anytime on our website, the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers.org, and they can watch the video on the social media as well. And I thank you all again for contribution, and looking forward for your contribution in the future as well.